Two hunters walked into a stretch of Ozark timber together on a warm afternoon in the fall of 1893, and only one of them walked back out on his own two legs. Both men were struck by the same kind of rattlesnake within the same week in the same general country, a bite low on the calf for one man and a bite on the forearm for the other. And by every plain measure, the two wounds were roughly comparable in severity when they happened. The first man's companions did exactly what every frontier man of that era believed, without a shadow of doubt, was the correct and life-saving response. They cut deep crosses over each fang mark with a hunting knife, took turns sucking hard at the wound to draw the poison out, tied a length of cord tight above the bite to keep the venom from traveling further up the limb, and poured whiskey into him steadily to fight off the shock. And they did every single one of those things with real courage and real care for their friend. That man lost most of the use of his leg for the rest of his life, the tissue around the bite dead and blackened for weeks afterward, and it was close by every account that survives, whether he lost the leg entirely or lost his life along with it. The second man's companion did something that, by the standards of that same era, looked almost like doing nothing at all. He kept his friend still, kept him calm, kept the bitten arm roughly level rather than tied off or hacked open, and got him to help as fast as the country allowed. That second man kept his arm, kept his life, and was back to ordinary work within a matter of weeks. The snake gets the blame for what happens to a man after a bite, and in a certain narrow sense, the snake certainly started the trouble. But across the whole span of recorded frontier history, and I want you to sit with this because it runs against everything most people still believe today, the actual treatment applied after a great many snake bites did more lasting damage to the victim than the venom itself very often would have done left entirely alone. That is not an exaggeration for effect, friend. It is the honest, documented conclusion of a great deal of careful medical study conducted over the past several decades, study that looked hard at exactly what happens to the human body during a venomous snake bite and exactly what each of the old trusted remedies actually accomplishes, and the results of that study should trouble anybody who still believes the way most people quietly do without ever questioning it, that cutting, sucking, and tying off a snake bite is simply common sense. Here's the twist, and I want you to sit with it before we go any further, because it is the whole spine of what I am handing you tonight. Every single one of the classic frontier snakebite remedies, cutting the wound open, sucking at it, tying off the limb above the bite, and pouring whiskey into the victim, either does essentially nothing to remove venom that is already working its way through the body, or actively makes the outcome worse, sometimes considerably worse than if the victim's companions had simply done nothing at all beyond keeping him calm and getting him to real help. I am not telling you this to frighten you away from ever venturing into snake country, because a snake bite, treated correctly with the knowledge modern medicine has worked out, is, for the great majority of victims today, a serious injury rather than a death sentence. I am telling you this because the myth of the old remedies is still alive and well, taught in some outdoor circles even now, believed by a great many people who have simply never had the actual science explained to them plainly, and that myth genuinely still costs people tissue, limbs, and occasionally lives every single year in this country. If you or somebody with you were bitten by a venomous snake tonight, most people, without ever having been taught otherwise, would trust exactly what those first hunters trusted in 1893, reaching for a knife, applying suction, tying something tight above the wound, because those actions feel like doing something decisive and active in a genuine emergency, and standing by calmly, keeping the victim still, feels to most people's instinct like doing dangerously little. That is the knowing we are digging back up tonight, neighbor. And in this particular case, digging it back up means unlearning something rather than learning something entirely new. We will get to every bit of it, honestly and completely, because getting this exactly right, the correct field response rather than the old, trusted, and genuinely dangerous one, is knowledge that could make the real difference between a serious injury and a lasting one, for you or for somebody standing beside you. I am Ezra Calhoun, and I have spent my whole life on a stretch of Ozark ground, my family has worked for the better part of 200 years, back in a hollow we still call Calhoun Hollow, tucked into the Missouri backcountry, ground that carries its own healthy population of timber rattlesnakes and copperheads, the kind of country where a person learns real respect for venomous snakes early and keeps that respect their whole life. My grandfather Gideon raised me on that ground, and he was born in 1919 and lived to be 89 years old, and he was bitten himself as a young man, low on the ankle by a copperhead while clearing brush, an experience that shaped how seriously he took this particular danger for the rest of his life. Gideon was treated in his own younger years with a version of the old cut and suck method that was still standard practice at the time, and he told me plainly later in his life, once the real science had finally caught up and confirmed what he had already begun to suspect from his own slow, difficult recovery, that he believed that treatment had cost him a good deal more healthy tissue and a good deal more pain than the bite itself would have caused if it had simply been left alone and treated with rest and real medical attention instead. By the time we are through here tonight, you will understand exactly how snake venom actually moves through the human body, a piece of biology that explains why cutting and sucking accomplish essentially nothing useful. You will know the honest, documented reason each of the classic old remedies, the knife, the suction, the tourniquet, and the whiskey, actually makes a real snake bite worse rather than better, explained plainly enough that you will never trust any of them again. You will know the actual signs worth watching and tracking after a bite, signs that matter to the medical professionals who will treat the victim rather than signs meant to guide any home remedy. You will know the real correct field response, the specific practice steps that actually give a snakebite victim the best possible outcome while waiting for real help to arrive. And you will know the honest history of why these dangerous old remedies persisted for as long as they did, a story involving genuine commercial products sold in good faith for decades before the real science finally caught up with them. That is where we are headed tonight, piece by piece, and I am leaving nothing out, because this is knowledge with real, serious stakes attached to it. There are 6 pieces to understanding the true danger behind old snakebite treatment, and the actual, correct response modern medicine has since confirmed works best, and I want every single one of them to leave you genuinely better prepared than those 2 frontier hunters in 1893, whether you ever encounter a venomous snake yourself or simply want to understand a piece of medical history that still actively misleads people today. 6 in order, and the order matters because the first piece has to break a piece of instinct almost everybody carries before anything else makes proper sense. The first 2 pieces explain how venom actually spreads through the body and why the instinct to act aggressively works directly against that reality. The middle pieces cover the honest signs worth tracking and the specific documented harm each old remedy actually causes. And the 6th piece is the plain human history of why these dangerous remedies persisted in common belief for as long as they did. The first piece is understanding plainly how venom actually moves through the human body after a bite, because this single piece of biology explains why nearly every classic old remedy misses the mark entirely. Snake venom, once injected beneath the skin, does not travel primarily through the bloodstream the way people commonly assume, at least not in the earliest and most critical minutes after a bite. It moves, for the most part, through the lymphatic system, a separate network of vessels running throughout the body that carries fluid, and in this case, venom, back toward the central circulation at a pace determined heavily by the physical movement of the muscles surrounding those vessels, rather than by the steady, active pumping the heart provides to blood in the circulatory system. This distinction matters enormously because it means the speed at which venom actually spreads through a victim's body depends significantly on how much that victim moves. Physical activity and muscle contraction actively pumping lymphatic fluid and therefore venom deeper into the body far faster than if the victim remained genuinely still. Here is the piece that connects directly to why the old aggressive remedies fail so badly, and it is a piece almost nobody in the 1800s had any way of understanding. Within a matter of minutes after a genuine venomous bite, venom has already begun moving out from the immediate bite site into the surrounding lymphatic tissue, well before anybody standing nearby could realistically draw a knife, cut the wound, and begin sucking at it. By the time those first hunters in 1893 had finished cutting crosses over the fang marks and begun applying suction, the venom responsible for the worst of the coming damage had, in all likelihood, already moved well beyond the immediate bite site into surrounding tissue that no amount of cutting or sucking at the original wound could ever reach. The old remedy was not merely imperfect. It was, from a biological standpoint, targeting a location the actual danger had already largely left behind. It helps to understand exactly why so many people, then and now, assume venom travels primarily through the bloodstream in the first place, because that assumption is not unreasonable on its face, simply incomplete. A bite does break the skin and does introduce venom directly into the body's tissue, and blood vessels do run close to the surface throughout the skin and muscle. So the instinct that venom must be entering the bloodstream immediately and directly is an understandable one. What that instinct misses is that the lymphatic system, a separate and less commonly understood network of vessels running alongside the blood vessels throughout the body, plays the dominant early role in carrying most snake venom, particularly the venom of pit vipers common across the American frontier, rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths among them, away from the bite site and into the broader body. Unlike blood, which the heart actively and continuously pumps throughout the body regardless of what a person is doing, lymphatic fluid moves primarily through the simple mechanical action of surrounding muscles contracting and relaxing as a person moves, meaning a person lying genuinely still, breathing calmly, moves that fluid, and the venom riding along inside it considerably more slowly than a person who is moving, tensing, or physically struggling. This is precisely why the medical guidance that has replaced the old remedies places such heavy emphasis on stillness and calm rather than on any direct intervention at the wound itself, because the actual lever available to a victim and the people helping him is not removing venom that has already begun moving, which none of the old remedies could genuinely accomplish, but slowing how quickly that movement happens in the first place, buying real time for actual medical treatment to arrive and take effect before the venom has spread as extensively through the body as it otherwise would. Venom spreads through the lymphatic system, driven significantly by physical movement rather than simply by the passage of time alone, and it begins that spread within minutes of a bite, well before any home remedy could realistically be applied in time to matter, even if that remedy actually worked as intended. Here is your first thing to carry out of tonight, and I will give you one at the end of every piece. The speed of venoms spread through the body is something a victim's own stillness can genuinely influence, which means the single most important early response to any snake bite has almost nothing to do with the wound itself and everything to do with how much the victim moves in the minutes and hours that follow. Now, given that venom spreads this quickly through a system cutting and sucking cannot meaningfully reach, why did an entire country trust those exact remedies for generations, treating them as plain common sense rather than a genuine mistake? This brings me to the second piece, and it explains the powerful, understandable instinct that kept those remedies alive for so long. The second piece is the specific human instinct that made the old remedies feel correct, and understanding it honestly explains why intelligent, careful people trusted this treatment for generations without ever seriously questioning it. A snake bite is a genuine emergency, sudden, frightening, and immediately visible in a way that demands some kind of response, and the human mind, faced with exactly that kind of frightening, visible crisis, strongly favors action that feels decisive, physical, and immediate over a response that looks from the outside like simply standing by and doing very little at all. Cutting the wound, applying suction, tying off the limb, these are all dramatic hands-on actions that feel, in the moment, like genuinely fighting back against the danger, giving both the victim and the people around him a real sense that everything possible was being done to help. Staying calm, keeping the victim still, and simply getting him to real medical help as quickly and safely as the country allowed, by contrast, feels passive, almost negligent, to a person's natural instinct in a genuine crisis, even though it happens to be the response actual medical science has since confirmed works considerably better. This is precisely the trap, and it is one that has fooled generation after generation of otherwise careful, sensible people, because the instinct favoring dramatic, hands-on action over calm restraint is deeply wired into how human beings respond to visible emergencies of every kind, not merely snake bites specifically. A frightened companion reaching for a knife and applying a tourniquet is not being foolish or careless. He is responding to his friend's emergency with every ounce of urgency and care he genuinely feels. And the tragedy is that this exact urgency, channeled into the wrong actions, actively worked against the outcome he was desperately trying to protect. Gideon told me once that his own father, watching him recover slow and in real pain from that copperhead bite, said something to him he never forgot, that the hardest thing a frightened man will ever be asked to do is stand still and wait when every instinct in his body is screaming at him to act, and that any fool can look busy in an emergency. But it takes a genuinely steady head to do the quiet, correct thing instead of the loud, satisfying one. Gideon carried that lesson forward the rest of his life, and he made certain to teach it to me plainly, well before he ever taught me the specific steps of a correct field response, because he understood that knowing the correct steps in the abstract means very little if a person's own instinct overrides them the moment real fear sets in. He used to make me practice more than once, simply sitting still and calm for a stretch of minutes, right after describing a hypothetical bite to me, testing whether I could actually hold that stillness under the pressure of imagined urgency before he ever moved on to teaching me the rest. There's a second piece of this instinct worth naming honestly because it complicates matters further. A great many snake bites, even from venomous species, turn out to involve little or no venom injection at all, what medical professionals call a dry bite. The snake striking defensively without releasing venom, which happens with real frequency, and which means a companion who reaches immediately for a knife and a tourniquet may, in a meaningful share of cases, be inflicting real unnecessary harm on a victim who was never envenomated in any serious way to begin with. This uncertainty, impossible to resolve with confidence in the field without proper medical evaluation, is one more reason the calm, observe, and transport approach makes more sense than any aggressive field treatment because it does no harm in the case of a dry bite while still giving a genuinely envenomated victim the best possible outcome, whereas cutting and tying off does real harm in both cases regardless of how much venom, if any, was actually delivered. With dramatic, hands-on physical action rather than calm restraint is powerful and entirely understandable. And recognizing that instinct in yourself in the moment it actually matters is the first real step toward overriding it with a correct response rather than the emotionally satisfying one. Now, given that venom is already spreading through the lymphatic system within minutes, what are the actual honest signs worth watching for after a bite? Signs that matter to the medical professionals who will eventually treat the victim rather than signs meant to guide any home remedy at all. This is the third piece, and it covers exactly what a careful person ought to track and report rather than attempt to treat on their own. The third piece is the honest, documented set of signs worth observing and recording after a venomous snake bite, information that genuinely helps the medical professionals who will treat the victim assess the severity of the envenomation and choose the correct treatment, most critically the correct dose of antivenom, rather than information meant to guide any decision about home treatment. The first thing worth tracking is the progression of swelling around the bite site, and the correct documented method for doing this involves marking the leading edge of the swelling directly on the skin with a pen, along with the time of that observation, and repeating that mark every 15 to 20 minutes as the swelling continues to spread. This simple, honest record gives arriving medical personnel an immediate objective picture of exactly how quickly the envenomation is progressing, information considerably more useful to them than a victim's own description of pain or discomfort alone. The second thing worth tracking is the character of the pain itself, because a bite from a venomous snake typically produces a burning, throbbing pain that intensifies over the following hour, distinctly different from the sharper, more immediate pain of a bite from a non-venomous species, though I want to be honest that this distinction alone is never reliable enough to determine venom status with real confidence, and any snake bite from a species that cannot be identified with total certainty deserves the same serious response as a confirmed venomous bite. The third thing worth tracking, and this one matters a great deal to the medical team that will eventually treat the victim, is any sign of systemic symptoms beyond the bite site itself, a tingling or metallic taste around the mouth, nausea, or a general sense of unwellness spreading beyond the immediate area of the bite, symptoms that can indicate the venom has begun affecting the body more broadly rather than remaining a purely local injury. Here is the rule, and it is 3 lines, the same shape as always. 1. Mark the leading edge of swelling with a pen and the time every 15 to 20 minutes, and hand that record to medical personnel the moment they arrive because it gives them real objective information no verbal description can match. 2. Note the character of the pain honestly, without trying to diagnose the species of snake from it alone, because that judgment belongs to trained medical professionals with real diagnostic tools, not to frighten bystanders in the field. 3. Watch for and report any systemic symptoms, tingling around the mouth, a metallic taste, or nausea, because these signs matter enormously to how quickly and how aggressively a medical team will need to respond once real help arrives. Swelling tracked honestly, pain character noted plainly, systemic symptoms watched carefully, and every single one of those observations exists to inform the real treatment that is coming, not to guide any treatment attempted in the field. Gideon told me, describing his own bite as a young man, that nobody in his own company thought to track anything at all in the way I have just described because the entire frontier understanding of a snake bite at that time was built around immediate aggressive treatment rather than careful observation and a fast trip to real help. He told me plainly that by the time he finally reached a doctor, hours after the bite and after considerable damage had already been done by the cutting and sucking his companions had applied with real, genuine care, nobody had any clear record of how the swelling had actually progressed, information that might have helped guide his treatment more precisely had anybody thought to gather it. That gap in his own care stuck with him, and it is part of why he made certain I understood from a young age that watching and recording carefully was every bit as important as anything else a person could do for a snakebite victim in the field. So there is your third thing to carry. Track the swelling with marks and times, note the pain honestly without self-diagnosing, and watch for systemic symptoms, and understand that every one of those observations exists to help real medical treatment, not to replace it. Now, here is where I have to break the pattern of this story for a moment, friend, because everything I have told you so far, how venom actually spreads and why the old instinct toward dramatic action took hold, explains the shape of the danger plainly. What comes next is the specific documented harm each individual old remedy actually causes, laid out honestly enough that you will never reach for any of them again, no matter how strong the instinct in the moment. The fourth piece is the honest, documented harm behind each of the classic old remedies, and I want to walk through every single one of them plainly, because understanding exactly why each one fails is what will actually override the powerful instinct the second piece described in the one moment it genuinely matters, cutting the wound first accomplishes essentially nothing useful against venom that has already begun spreading through the lymphatic system within minutes, as the first piece explained, while creating a genuine new wound, additional tissue damage, and a real risk of severing nerves, blood vessels, or tendons in the immediate area, damage that has nothing to do with the venom itself and everything to do with the cutting. A great many documented cases of lasting tissue damage and impaired function following a snakebite trace back not to the venom alone, but to the combined damage of the venom and an unnecessary knife wound layered directly on top of it. Sucking at the wound, second, has been studied directly, and the honest documented result is that suction, whether applied by mouth or by a mechanical device sold specifically for this purpose, removes only a genuinely negligible amount of venom, typically well under 1 part in 20 of the total venom actually injected, and often considerably less than that, an amount far too small to meaningfully change the outcome, while introducing a real risk of infection from bacteria in the mouth of whoever is doing the sucking, adding a genuine new medical complication to a situation that did not need one. Tying off the limb above the bite with a tight tourniquet, third, is of everything on this list the single most dangerous remedy of them all, because a tight tourniquet does not stop venom from spreading through the lymphatic system the way the old-timers believed it would. It cuts off blood flow to the entire limb below the tie, concentrating both the venom and the resulting tissue damage into a smaller, more severely affected area, and it carries a genuine risk of causing the loss of the limb entirely through prolonged oxygen deprivation, an outcome considerably worse than the bite itself would likely have caused left alone. And releasing a tight tourniquet suddenly, after it has been in place for any real length of time, can send a concentrated bolus of pooled venom into general circulation all at once, a documented cause of sudden, severe systemic reaction in victims who had, up to that point, been showing only mild local symptoms. Whiskey, fourth, and this remedy in particular, deserves honest attention because it remained trusted longer than almost any other does real harm on two separate fronts. Alcohol dilates blood vessels and increases heart rate, both of which genuinely accelerate the spread of venom through the body rather than slowing it down, working directly against the stillness and calm that actually helps a victim's outcome. And alcohol impairs judgment and pain perception at exactly the moment accurate observation and honest communication with arriving medical help matter most, while also complicating any surgical or medical intervention a victim might need once real treatment becomes available. A victim given whiskey for shock was, in a very real sense, being given a substance that worked against nearly every single thing his body actually needed in that moment. Here is your fourth thing to carry, and it is the hardest one to hold on to because it runs against every instinct the second piece described. Cutting causes real unnecessary tissue damage while removing essentially no venom. Sucking removes a genuinely negligible amount of venom while risking infection. A tight tourniquet concentrates damage and risks the limb entirely. Whiskey accelerates the very spread it was believed to slow. Every single one of these old remedies, trusted for generations with real sincerity and real care, does documented harm rather than documented good. And knowing that plainly in advance is the only real defense against reaching for one of them in the genuine panic of an actual emergency. Now, if every one of the old remedies actually makes things worse, what does the actual correct field response look like? The specific steps modern wilderness medicine has confirmed give a snakebite victim the best real chance while waiting for genuine medical help. That is the fifth piece, and it is the practical, actionable core this whole lesson has been building toward. The fifth piece is the actual correct field response to a venomous snakebite, confirmed by real medical study, and considerably simpler, though not necessarily emotionally easier, than the old remedies it replaces. Start with calm. The single most important thing anyone can do for a snakebite victim, and the hardest thing to actually do, in a genuine emergency is to keep the victim as calm and as physically still as possible because, as the first piece explained, physical movement and an elevated heart rate both actively accelerate the spread of venom through the lymphatic system. A frightened, panicked, moving victim is doing real, measurable harm to his own outcome, while a calm, still victim is giving his own body the best possible chance. Second, remove any rings, watches, or tight clothing near the bite site immediately before swelling has a chance to progress, because a ring or a tight sleeve, harmless in the moment, can become a genuine secondary hazard once swelling sets in, cutting off circulation to a finger or a limb in exactly the same way an intentional tourniquet would, entirely by accident rather than by anybody's design. Third, keep the bitten limb at a position roughly level with the heart wherever practical. Neither dramatically elevated, which some old advice mistakenly recommended believing it would slow the spread, nor held low and dependent, which can worsen local swelling. A plain level position generally considered the safest middle ground by modern wilderness medicine guidance. Fourth, immobilize the bitten limb with a splint if materials allow, the same basic principle used for a broken bone, because a limb that cannot bend or flex reduces the muscular pumping action that drives lymphatic flow, directly supporting the same goal as keeping the victim generally still and calm. Fifth, and this is the step that actually matters more than any other single action available in the field, get the victim to real medical care as quickly as the terrain and the available transportation genuinely allow, because the only true treatment for a serious venomous snakebite is antivenom, a real medical product developed and refined over more than a century of careful science administered by trained medical professionals, and no field remedy of any kind, old or modern, has ever come close to replacing what a properly administered dose of antivenom can actually do for a victim's outcome. There is one more piece of this correct field response worth walking through honestly, because it involves a genuine judgment call rather than a simple rule, and that is the question of how the victim actually gets to help. If a vehicle or some other means of transport that does not require the victim to walk or exert himself is available, that is always the better choice, because it keeps the victim still and calm exactly the way the earlier pieces of this lesson emphasized. If no such transport is available and the victim must move under his own power to reach help, he should move at a slow, steady, calm pace rather than hurrying or running, understanding that a faster pace driven by fear and urgency works directly against his own outcome by increasing exactly the kind of muscular activity that speeds venom through the lymphatic system. This is a genuinely difficult thing to ask of a frightened person in real pain, and it is worth companions understanding this principle clearly enough to gently but firmly slow a panicked victim down, rather than allowing fear to drive a pace that does real, measurable harm. Gideon carried this particular piece of the lesson with real weight, because he told me that in his own case, decades before the science had properly worked this out, his own company had moved him quickly and roughly toward help, jostling and hurrying in a way he later came to believe had likely worsened his own outcome, layered on top of the damage the cutting and sucking had already done. He held no bitterness toward the men who helped him that day, understanding plainly that they had acted with every bit of urgency and care a frightened man could offer a friend. But he wanted me to understand clearly and without any confusion that urgency applied in the wrong direction, however well intentioned, is not the same thing as genuine help. Keep the victim calm and physically still, reducing movement as much as the situation genuinely allows. Remove rings, watches, and tight clothing near the bite immediately before swelling makes that harder to do safely. Keep the bitten limb at a position roughly level with the heart. Immobilize that limb with a splint if materials allow. And above everything else, get the victim to real medical care as quickly as safely possible, because anti-venom, not any field remedy, is what actually saves tissue and saves lives. That is the full, correct response, considerably simpler than the old remedies it replaces, and considerably more effective, confirmed by exactly the kind of careful medical study those 1893 hunters never had access to. Now, here's another pattern break, friend, because we are at the edge of the last piece, and I want you square with me before we step over it. Everything so far, how venom actually spreads, why dramatic action felt correct, the honest signs worth tracking, the documented harm of every old remedy, and the actual correct field response represents real, hard-won medical knowledge, confirmed through careful study over the past several decades. What comes next is the honest history of why the old, harmful remedies persisted in common belief for as long as they genuinely did, and it involves a real, documented commercial product that carried these old methods forward long after they should have been questioned. The sixth piece, the last piece, is the plain honest history of why cut and suck treatment in particular persisted in common American belief for so many decades after any careful scientist ever seriously tested whether it actually worked. And it traces back to a real commercially sold product rather than any single dramatic historical event. Through a good stretch of the 20th century, manufactured snakebite kits, complete with a small blade and a mechanical suction device, were sold widely and in good faith across this country, marketed as essential emergency equipment for anybody spending real time in snake country, carried by hunters, hikers, and rural families for generations as standard, trusted gear, the same way a family might carry a basic first aid kit today without a second thought about whether every item inside it had actually been rigorously tested. The trouble, and I want to be honest and specific about this, is that nobody had actually subjected the core assumption behind those kits, that mechanical suction could meaningfully remove injected venom, to rigorous scientific testing until considerably later than most people would expect, well into the later decades of the 20th century, when researchers finally measured, directly and carefully, exactly how much venom suction devices actually removed from a wound under realistic conditions. The results, confirming the negligible amount I described in the fourth piece, took real time to work their way from medical journals into common public understanding, and commercial snakebite kits, remarkably, continued to be manufactured and sold for a genuine stretch of years, even after the scientific case against them had become fairly well established within the medical community itself, simply because changing decades of trusted marketed practice takes real time, and a product already sitting in millions of American homes does not disappear from the shelf the moment a study calls its core function into question. This is not, I want to be clear, a story of anybody knowingly selling a dangerous product for profit. It is a story of a genuine, sincere folk belief, reasonable enough on its face that cutting and sucking might remove poison from a wound, that got turned into a real commercial product before anybody had properly tested whether the underlying idea actually worked, and that product's continued presence on store shelves and in family first aid kits, in turn, reinforced the very belief that had created it in the first place. A self-sustaining cycle that took real, dedicated scientific effort to finally break. Anti-venom itself, the actual treatment that does genuinely work, has its own honest history worth knowing, developed initially in the final years of the 1800s through careful scientific work studying how the immune system responds to venom, and refined steadily through the 20th century into the reliable, effective treatment available at hospitals across snake country today. A genuine piece of medical progress that took considerably longer to fully displace the old trusted folk remedies than the science itself actually required. So that is the sixth piece, the honest heart of the whole thing. Snake venom spreads through the lymphatic system within minutes, driven significantly by a victim's own movement, which means calm stillness matters more than any dramatic action taken at the wound site itself. Cutting, sucking, tying off, and whiskey all either accomplish essentially nothing useful or actively cause documented additional harm, confirmed by real medical study conducted over the past several decades. The actual correct response, calm, stillness, removing constricting items, keeping the limb level, immobilizing it, and getting to real medical care as fast as safely possible, is simpler than the old remedies and considerably more effective. And the old remedies persisted for as long as they did not through any conspiracy, but through a genuine commercial product sold in good faith for generations that outlasted the scientific case against it by a good stretch of years before the real evidence finally became common public knowledge. This was never really a story about the snake itself, friend, because the snake in both of those 1893 cases did roughly the same thing, delivered roughly the same bite. It was about the difference between a response that felt urgent and decisive and a response that actually helped, and that difference is exactly what separated the hunter who kept his leg from the one who very nearly lost his. If you or somebody with you is ever bitten by a snake you cannot positively identify as harmless, you will not reach for a knife, apply suction, tie anything off, or offer a drink for the shock. You will keep the victim calm and still, remove anything tight near the bite, keep the limb level, splint it if you can, and move as quickly and as safely as the country allows toward real medical help, tracking the swelling honestly along the way. That is not fear talk, and it is not doom talk. That is the same hard-won, carefully confirmed knowledge that Gideon carried forward from his own difficult recovery, knowledge that could make the real difference for you or for somebody standing beside you between a serious injury and a lasting one. Done by hand, told straight,